Welcome everyone to our webinar, Ask the AI Experts, a live panel on AI risks, rules, and real-world usage of AI. My name is Nick. I'm one of the legal solutions consultants here at LegalVision, and today we're really fortunate to be joined by two other guests, Lauren McKee, also from here at LegalVision, who's one of our practice leaders, and Cat, who is the head of venture at Nomos. Lauren and Kat, would you like to briefly introduce yourselves, starting with yourself, Lauren?
Thank you, Nick. Yes, I'm a practice leader at LegalVision. I work in the contracts and regulatory team. I do a lot of work in the privacy and IP space. I'm very excited to be chatting today about AI.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. And yourself, Kat?
Thanks, Nick. A real pleasure for the invitation from LegalVision. For those who don't know Nomos yet, we are a technology consulting company, and increasingly our portfolio more and more is in AI. We're an Australian company that's been around for about a decade. And what we do is we build essentially custom software. It takes the shapes of applications, apps and mobile websites, and increasingly AI. My role at Nomos is I look after our venture arm, where we look at investing in really high potential, high impact startups, as well as head of growth, where I really act as the main conduit for serving our customers. And really core to Nomos is the fact that we're very human centric, and we're always thinking about learning and growing, which is essentially in our name. Nomos, as in Rolling Stone gathers Nomos. Thanks, Nick.
I love it. Thanks, Kat. Thank you, Kat and Lauren, for your introductions. And yeah, obviously the basis of this conversation today is to go through some Q&As, but before we do get there, I just wanted to run through a little bit of housekeeping for everyone who's jumped on. So yeah, first of all, you will be receiving the recording and the slides in your email. So if there's anything you want to refer back to or watch again, that'll be coming through to you. Any questions that you haven't already submitted, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll answer them when we get to the Q&A section. If you see any questions that anyone else has posted, feel free to upvote them so that there's a better chance that they do get answered in today's session. And then at the end of the session, there will be a feedback survey, and that would be really helpful if you could provide some feedback in that for us, because it's really important that we make these as valuable as possible for you. And by being part of the webinar today, you do also get the opportunity to claim a complimentary legal health check or consultation with us. So if you leave your contact details at the end in that survey, our team will be in touch to organise that with you. Now, what I also want to introduce before we get into the Q&A section is the LegalVision membership. And basically what that is through becoming a member of LegalVision, you get access to over 100 of our specialist lawyers on an unlimited basis through our membership model, where you get access to a wide range of legal resources. Different to hourly rates or upfront expenses, it's more of an ongoing membership style solution so you can have cost certainty for your legals. Now, some of the key benefits of that is, yeah, absolutely, you get unlimited legal advice consultations through the membership. And then there's a number of core inclusions from documentation drafting, documentation reviewing, trademark registrations, employment support, business structuring support. So there's a wide range of legal resources packed in there. And it's a very valuable way that we assist the clients we work with with their legal work. As I mentioned, you do get a complimentary legal health check to discuss how that can assist your business. So make sure you fill out your details in the survey. Now, handing over to Lauren and Kat. Lauren and Kat, would you like to take it away with the first question?
Thanks, Nick. So we've had a couple of questions submitted prior to today's webinar, and again, encourage you to submit questions live in the chat box there. But the first question that's come through is, how can I use ChatGPT effectively without risking my client's personal information? Kat, did you want to take this one?
Thanks, Lauren. I think this is a great question, and it's something that we're all, as businesses, thinking about how do we do this better. In terms of like risking client information and using ChatGPT, we all know, all our team members are using it. I think the first thing to think about is that client personal information. What are we putting into the systems? So having a really clear understanding as organizations, as teams, as companies, what is the information that we're putting in and what are we specifically using it for? Now, in terms of some of the risk, or there's also essentially a lot of legal applications of this depending on your domain. I'll let Lauren talk through that, but my kind of main advice to a lot of our clients who are using AI technology is to have some familiarity with the particular system you're using. Like in this case with OpenAI, ChatGPT, what are some of those service terms that you're bound by based on what your level of membership is with that particular kind of system. But I'll let Lauren take some of the legal nuance on that as well.
Thank you, Kat. That's exactly right. So in terms of personal information, I guess the first question is, well, what is that? So personal information is information that can identify someone. So this is things from someone's name, email address, their medical records, their driver's license, any sort of information that can identify someone will be considered personal information. And so it will be captured by the Privacy Act. So when you're putting your client's personal information into any sort of AI system, you need to make sure you're complying with the Privacy Act. So the sorts of things we want to think about are, well, does the person whose information is affected, do they know I'm going to be doing this with their information? Would they reasonably expect that I'm doing this with their information? So it's important that you've got sort of an up-to-date privacy policy, I suppose, on how it is that you're handling personal information. The next question is, well, yeah, do they expect that you're going to do that? Is it related to the purpose for which you collected information from them? Maybe if it's, you're using it for sort of straightforward things, but perhaps if you are using it for a different purpose, then they're not going to expect that. And I think that the key thing that comes up a lot then is what the AI system does with the data you input into it. So as Kat sort of alluded to there, one of the key things you should be doing is checking the service terms to see, well, are they going to train their AI system using the data that I input? And if they are, I am sure your clients, unless they've clicked a box saying, yes, please train your systems with my data, they're not expecting that and you shouldn't be doing that. And so that's why we see a lot of guidance out there basically saying that if there's commercially available AI systems, particularly when they're free, usually they're free for a reason, and they're going to use that data to train their models. So if you're running a business, you're going to be putting personal information into an AI system. You want to be doing your due diligence to have a look at what systems are out there that will protect the personal information that you are inputting into it. They're not going to be training their systems with it. They have good data security measures in place. They're the first two things that I'd be checking before using any sort of AI system. So with ChatGPT, there's different levels. And there's different access controls as well. So I know even on the free model, you can go in and make a change there so that they're not training the model with your with personal information you input. But that's not really enough, I suppose. If you're doing something like running a law firm, you want to make sure that it's absolute, that they're not training their models with your personal information. So I think what is useful is making sure you've got policies and procedures in place within your business to stop this sort of activity from happening. So whether or not that your workplace does some due diligence and works out, well, this is the AI system I want to use, but now let's do some training to make sure that my staff are not just using their personal ChatGPT account and putting through all the personal information of our clients, which sort of defeats the purpose of you doing that due diligence and picking that AI system in the first place. Yeah. Did you have any thing you wanted to add there on that, Kat?
Yeah, I think that was a really great and thorough response, Lauren. I think the only thing I would add from a technical system perspective is also to take that technical lens when you're looking at doing due diligence on which AI systems you would implement as a company. One, having a look at where some of the data is stored. Data residency is something that often comes up. So having a look at where is the data being stored and processed in those various different systems, and does that expose you based on the industry you might work in? And yeah, what are those pros and cons of each of the systems? What are they specialized in? What are they particularly good at? And then, yeah, making an informed decision about which system you take on. And, you know, if you're new to AI, I would say it's, you know, it's a bit of a new frontier, which with all new frontiers presents a multitude of opportunities, but also challenges. So a way to de-risk is also you could run a pilot with a smaller team within your organization, see how it goes, test out some of those boundary conditions and some of those risk exposure before you do a full organization rollout. I'd also ask, you know, usually recommend that teams look at the Australian government guidance on AI ethics, which I think is a really great voluntary guideline to help you think through the ethics of using AI. And it has some really interesting principles in there about respecting people's data rights, as well as thinking about how AI implications on the workplace. So there's 8 core principles there. They all are pretty sensible. And I think organizations can use it as a bit of a guardrail in terms of implementation. There's also lots of case studies on how different industries have implemented it. And we at Nomos, we're pretty familiar with the regulations and the standards. And it's something that we've reviewed as a leadership team and as a broader organization. And it's really helped guide us.
I think that's a good point there, Kat, because of course we've got privacy implications, but there's other implications too, especially regarding ethics. So we know that some models have been trained with certain data sets that perhaps have a tendency to have various biases towards different, you know, demographics in society. We know that the information that the output, I suppose, is not always accurate. There might be issues with it. So human oversight is also something that you should have a think about in your organization, how you can sort of factor that in. There's a couple of questions that have come through on the chat here, which is great to see. So one of them is, should all firms who now use AI include an AI section in their privacy policy? I would say yes. Basically, the crux of a privacy policy is you should be open and transparent about how you're using personal information. So typically what I'm seeing now is a section in the privacy policy of the reasons that you will use AI systems and then, yeah, what you're using it for. So whether that is for BAU sort of, you know, research, or whether that is for any, I guess, data and, you know, graphs and the like, analytics that you're using internally, or whether that's for client output, I would recommend that is being, you're transparent in your privacy policy there. There is also another question on AI prompts and returns to be discovered in legal proceedings. I suppose that question is quite nuanced. It would just depend on what the legal proceedings are and what the rights there were, of whether they could look into your internet history and the like. So I won't go into too much detail on that. And then there's another question on whether it's required to disclose you've used AI for images or text. There's not a lot of background to this question. Kat, did you have any thoughts on that one before I jump in?
I think it's probably more of a legal angle, but
yeah.
I think
yeah. I think look, if you're creating things for your clients, I suppose, or you're, you know, creating a table or something, I wouldn't necessarily say that you need to disclose that that's how it was created. I'd say with images, it's a bit more risky. And the reason for that is you don't necessarily know where that image has come from. It could have been reproduced for a different business. It could have been taken from somewhere else. So it's good to be upfront about those things. If you are using some sort of chatbot, you know, if people are using on your website, interacting with a chatbot, you should certainly be upfront that they're conversing with an AI agent and not with a human. So I would say transparency is normally a good thing, but each situation is different. Yeah. Kat, did you want to jump into some of the other questions we've received?
Sure. I think a previous question we received, which is quite an interesting one, how safe is our information when using AI in-house? with proprietary data and shared via APIs and keys. I think this is a really interesting one. And again, it's similar to, using GPT. What you want to be looking at, again, is the service terms of all the systems you use. So if you're using a particular AI in-house, and then there's APIs into other external systems that you're also using, it's really good for your organization to have visibility of what all the service terms are of each of those pieces of technology you're using as part of your kind of work engine. And the safety and risk is really governed by some of the service terms, like how is, which parts of the information is those other systems taking through as part of the API trolls, where is that information then processed? And that will give you a lot of clues into how safe that information is being guarded, and particularly if it's proprietary, sensitive information that's critical to your business. Again, you might want to start thinking about how you segment what data is shared in what systems, and then who has access to those systems, and then who is doing some of the refining of the information in that system, and who's accessing the outputs of that system. So just taking a step back and mapping out that kind of system flow or system architecture, and thinking who has access, what are some of the exposures and risk, and doing some of that mapping before you go full live, I guess. And then again, running a bit of a pilot before you've made all these core changes to your systems. Would be my kind of advice there. Lauren, is there a particular legal angle to some of that, particularly around proprietary and safety of information?
Yeah, so I suppose some other things that you want to have a think about is if you've entered into contracts with your clients, you might have agreed to certain confidentiality provisions, or you may have agreed that you're not going to use, or you're going to let your customer know when you're using certain third-party providers. You may have agreed to only store data in certain countries. So have a look through those contracts you've agreed with to see whether you've put any sort of additional obligations on yourself. And then when reviewing the systems that you're looking to use, of course, it's really useful, as Kat said, if they've got various sort of privacy settings that you can play around with. You want to also make sure that you look through their privacy policy. Typically on websites, there will be an FAQ section on privacy or some more information. These AI systems are doing that because they know that's what people want to see. And so they know that if they're upfront about that, you're more likely to sign on to their services. So I would be having a look through the website, do your due diligence, make sure that you're asking those questions around, well, what happens with my personal data once I've uploaded it? There are some more questions coming through on the chat, which is excellent to see. A couple of questions on disclaimers and privacy policies. So, and being, I guess, transparent. So you're absolutely correct that a privacy policy often just sits on a website and perhaps people are not looking at it. Another obligation that businesses have under the Privacy Act is to make people aware of what personal information they're collecting and what they're going to do with it at the time they collect information from someone. And this is often called a privacy collection notice. So if you are collecting information at any point, that is the time where you can tell people that you are using AI to sort of handle and process their personal information. There is another question on disclaimers. What disclaimers should be provided for tech companies who are exposing AI agents to a customer? So I am assuming that this is from the perspective of the tech company that's created the AI agent. Now, there's a couple of things to think about here. One is you're going to have a contract in place with your client. So with that client, you will put a bunch of obligations on them, I suppose. You'll want them to make sure that they're transparent with their clients about the fact that they're using your service, and you'll want them to be to take responsibility, I guess, for using that. However, they're going to have expectations on you as well, and in terms of building that product. So I guess there's different sorts of AI agents. Some AI agents are working as an employee of yours, I suppose, whereas others are like chatbots on a website. If they're having a public interaction with individuals, then I would suggest that you build it into the functionality that it's clear that it's AI. If it's happening internally, well, then you're going to need to put some obligations on your client to make sure that they're transparent with their clients. There is an interesting question here around drafting an AI policy for the workplace. Any templates or guidance to help with a starting point? I'll run through a couple of things to think about. Kat, you might have some interesting points to mention on this. I suppose when I think of AI usage policies, I think of wanting to set out really the responsibilities of everyone in your business, what you would consider to be acceptable use. So what you're happy for your staff what services you're happy for them to use, or what information you're happy for them to upload, as well as what you consider not acceptable use. And then usually a reminder really around security and privacy, around their logins, making sure they're not sharing it with anyone else, flagging anything to you if they any sort of concerns arise, or if they feel like there's a lot of inaccuracies appearing. Kat, did you have some further things you wanted to add here?
Yeah, I think a lot of the times having a conversation, I guess at the leadership level or the wider organizational level, in terms of some of the pros and cons and the key risk areas. What are some of the risk and challenges of using the AI, thinking through that. And then like with a lot of policy, policies become alive when you talk about it and provide really tangible case studies for your team members. So I think it's also good to have the conversation alive. Something that the AI ethic guidelines suggest is actually having a bit of an AI committee or an AI group within the organization to think pretty actively about it. That way it's not set and forget kind of policy. And as I alluded to earlier, given that AI is a little bit of a new frontier, it's a wild west, if you like to think about it that way. There's a lot of unknowns, risks that we don't know yet. So when you're setting a policy, think about, how can you make that policy dynamic? Because there could be guardrails that you put in that seem really sensible at the time, but is actually kind of crippling to either the use of AI or how it's helpful to your business. So having a kind of dynamic look at the policy and the rollout, that's something I would also recommend. And then bringing together a team or a committee to, really help the organization understand how to implement AI in a sensible way. I think that's also really useful advice. And I think there was a question that, which might be related here, around what was the name of the governing body we mentioned? Lauren, was there one you mentioned? I did mention the ethics.
Yeah, so I think both are useful. What was the ethics one called? Yeah,
so under the Federal Department of Industry has written, let me just get the official name of it. It's Department of Industry, and it's Australia's Artificial Intelligence, AI, Ethics Principles. And if you go to the Department of Industry, at the federal level, there is a kind of link, a full page on what those principles are. There's 8 principles, and there's also some case studies of how they've been implemented in particular industry sectors like healthcare.
On the privacy side of things, the regulator is the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. So that's the OAIC. Last year, they released some incredibly useful guidance on AI. They have 2 publications. One is for businesses that want to implement AI into their day-to-day work life, and the other is for businesses or tech companies that are creating AI systems. So regardless of which one you fall into, I'd strongly recommend having a look at those publications, because it basically sets out step by step what you should be thinking about in terms of privacy when either developing or engaging an AI system. There is an interesting point here, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, Kat, around the fact that often AI gives incorrect answers. So someone's mentioned ChatGPT. We had an interesting case in the legal world recently where there was a lawyer in WA who had used AI to prepare for a court case, and AI had hallucinated various cases that didn't even exist. And of course, that lawyer is now no longer practicing. And so, of course, in addition to AI being useful and helping us in our day-to-day lives, there's a risk of error, and it's important that you've got professionals there with human oversight to double check the work that they're doing. Kat, what's your experience of this been?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And sometimes because how confident AI often sounds, there isn't, we naturally don't contest it or apply the same critical thinking that we would otherwise if it just sounded a little less confident. And I think one thing to explain about how our current kind of iterations of AI, like a lot of the models are essentially large language models. And essentially how they work is they're a statistical model that almost predicts what's the most highest probability thing that it should say next. So it's kind of like auto completing based on a statistical model. And so what it's very good at is mimicry. So it's really good at mimicking what should be said. And what we've come to discover is even in that world of mimicry, it's quite useful. It's quite useful at generating answers that are, 60-80% sounding like what an expert would say in that field. But what we need to know, I think, as practitioners, people using AI, is that essentially it's a parrot. So it does not know what it's saying. Just like a parrot can copy what I say and have a conversation with me, doesn't mean the parrot actually comprehends. And so, yes, it can give very inaccurate answers, and it can hallucinate as a result of that parroting. And it can also come up with some really creative responses that actually are quite, accurate in some instances. So I guess in my experience, I've always found it I would say like a very industrious intern. I can ask it any question and it will, in a blink of an eye, give me something that sounds pretty confident and pretty coherent. But my word of warning would be, as an expert or people who've practiced in various different fields and domains, we really need to keep the human in the loop, and we really need to have that kind of oversight and switch on that kind of critical thinking part of our brain. Like, is this actually what I would say as an expert? And, often a lot of the AI are also searching the internet for us and, summarizing things for us. So I would always, advise our clients and even our teams to go back to that original source and have a curious mindset, because even if it's a great summary, it's nice to see what that source code looks like, what that original first principle thing was actually stating, to do that kind of final check through. So yeah, that would be my kind of advice. My experience is, it's actually pretty good. It's much better than I thought it would be. And in a lot of instances where I've used it, it is, 60 to 70% pretty there, but it doesn't get the nuance very well. So you do have to add that extra layer in.
Totally agree there, Kat. And I think that there's an importance there of having that human oversight, but it's also sped things up a lot for me and had a huge benefit, because if you do know what you're doing, then it can increase efficiencies, because you can review the output as you would anything else and double check that it's exactly what you want it to be. There are some questions here on the AI policies, as again on anti-discrimination legislation in relation to AI. We touched on this before. There's certainly been many case studies around various AI or automated decision-making tools, I guess, which have been trained on inconsistent data sets. There might be models which, there was a case I remember whereby they were using an automated decision model to decide whether or not people were eligible for credit cards. And it was the 90% of people it proved were men, and it was just rejecting all the women. And we see that in lots of different areas across society. And so I think it's useful to bring into your AI policy and useful to bring into your training, but also useful to have a think about when you're choosing what systems you want to use, while making sure you're doing your due diligence, checking out the reviews there, running some testing to see what the results are and if you're happy with it before going any further with that.
Yeah, and to add to that, Lauren, I think this is where the Australian government corporate AI principles are pretty useful. There are a few like principles within that address that accessibility and I guess biases that it can be built into AI systems. So the ethics principles talks about one, protecting for like fairness. AI systems should be inclusive and accessible, and they should not involve or result in unfair discrimination. So really thinking about that particular ethic clause as you're building and including AI into your systems. Transparency and explainability. So just being able to show where you've used AI. And I think another really important one is contestability. So when you are using an AI system to make decisions, enabling a safeguard where, you know, users of your system can contest that result. I think that creates a bit of a backlog and also helps improve the system that you're building. So it's something to think about. Now in Australia, our kind of regulation around this is voluntary at this stage, but if you are operating internationally, your business has got overseas entities, or you're dealing with overseas entities, you know, it should be noted that the GDPR, which is the European regulation, is much firmer on a lot of these clauses. And so GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation, and it was I think it was started in May 2018 in EU, and so it's actually much stronger in terms of its guidance. Although I'm not a lawyer, so I'll let Lauren speak to some of that.
Well, I think the other interesting thing about the EU, which is well further along than Australia, that doesn't have any AI legislation, is they have the EU AI Act. And so the EU AI Act sets out different sorts of AI systems. I suppose it completely prohibits them in some regards. So if you've got systems that are doing things around like social scoring, for example, that's just banned. A lot of the obligations fall on the developers of the sort of documentation they need to provide, the transparency they need to provide, the security measures they need to build in place to sell their products. But it sort of separates it out between high risk and lower risk products. Did you want to take another one of the questions, Kat?
Yeah, sure. I think maybe we can jump around a bit. There was a really interesting question that came through around, let me just find it. What are some of the, so many questions. What are the minimum requirements for startups in quality checking AI outputs for clients on a platform? I thought that was a pretty interesting question. I think, like, as you know, startup organizations are always kind of grappling with, you know, limited resource, limited runway, and trying to get more done with less. And so, of course, AI presents a really great opportunity there. I think from a like technical systems perspective, things to think about. Particularly in the early stages of AI rollout, I would always recommend having a clear human in the loop, and, you know, really testing critically some of the outputs. And this is particularly where, you know, you're dealing with pretty sensitive information in very sensitive sectors like medical, legal, finance, HR. And if the AI is being used in some sort of decision making there, having a person who was, you know, responsible and a domain expert in these areas, really checking through the outputs before anything goes live and before you start interacting with customers. Another piece of advice I'd have is around benchmarking, like as an organization, having a really clear understanding of what does good look like in terms of output from the AI and what does bad look like. And then you can, you know, build in some automated testing to see how your system is benchmarking against that good versus bad responses. And I think Lauren alluded to this earlier, which is really around clear disclaimers. I think it's good business practice as well as quite ethical to explain to your customers what you're using AI for, and what, you know, and even really explain what are some of the benefits that they receive from using the AI, but also potentially some of the risk. And I think one of the listeners alluded to before that, you know, like there's privacy policy and it's just a document that remains dormant on your website. I think as, you know, really good technologists or users of AI, it's really good to have an active conversation with your customers about where you are using technology and how it's like helping, but also some of the risk and what you're doing to mitigate some of those risks. Another interesting thing to think about, and it's easier actually as a startup to build in some of these guardrails, is around like providing an escalation path. And again, that two-way conversation. If users are using it and there's something that goes wrong, or if your team's using it and something goes wrong, what is the escalation path, or what's the pause button for the AI system? And then, you know, as we're using technology, having a really clear understanding from a legal perspective, what is some of the exposure there, you know, which regions are you working in, and what are the regulation environments in those regions, where are your customers coming from, and what are the implications of that for your customers. That's kind of like would be my minimum. And I know it sounds like a lot, but it builds a lot of robustness into your business early on. And if it's something that's going to save you time and money in the long term, it's good to invest early, I think. And at a startup, it's very easy to do some of these things right. When you're a large organization, it's often sometimes a bit harder and a bit slower. Anything you'd add to that, Lauren?
I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. I might jump through, we've got sort of 5 minutes left, so I'll try jump through a couple of other questions. There's one here that's come through about the implications of using AI for medical note taking. I won't spend too much time on this, but I suppose the first thing is that when you are dealing with sensitive information, you should always be thinking about privacy, but you should be thinking about it a whole lot more when you're dealing with sensitive information like health information. And whilst we've got the Privacy Act there, we're also getting industry guidance. So AHPRA, the governing body in the medical industry, has basically released guidance saying we don't want anyone using AI for medical note taking without getting patient consent. And so it's useful to have a look at what is happening in the industry that you're working in. This happened to me in a medical appointment the other day, actually, for the first time ever. I'd been advising clients that they need to get consent, and then I walked in and someone was using one of these AI note-taking tools. They sought consent. They gave me all the background information as they should. So in the medical world, and we're seeing it not just with sort of GPs, but also in the NDIS space. These are the sorts of things you need to think about. The other thing for any businesses out there that are creating any AI tool in the medical space, you need to have a think about, well, is this actually a medical device, and am I going into the world of needing to be regulated under the Therapeutic Goods Register? So something to think about if you are creating software or AI in the medical industry. A couple of questions here around AI agents and liability, I suppose, of using AI. I think ultimately, if you're using an AI agent in your business, you're responsible for the AI agent's actions. Yes, you've got a provider that's giving you a software tool, but they're essentially giving you an employee, just like you would be responsible for your employees. You now have this piece of software, this tool. You need to double check that everything it's doing you're happy with before that's going elsewhere, just like you would, as Kat sort of mentioned before, treating them like an intern, just as you would double check the intern's work. I would be doing the same for any sort of AI agent. And as I mentioned before with that lawyer's case where AI had hallucinated and then they relied on that, I mean, ultimately it was the lawyer that got in trouble there. And so you should be using these tools to help you to become more efficient. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you need to make sure that you are taking responsibility for the actions of using AI. There's also a couple of questions around employees using AI, employees going rogue, I suppose. I think that's where It comes down to making sure you've got good training in place. You can have a policy, but as Kat mentioned, if it just sits in the corner and no one reads it, everyone forgets about it, well, then that's no good, is it? You need to be reminding people of how they're allowed to use AI, encouraging it really in safe ways, but reminding them of what they're not meant to do. So they're not meant to be using their personal accounts for AI, for example. And if people are engaging in misconduct with AI, then that's no different to engaging in misconduct in general as an employee. The same sort of employment regulations and HR processes would apply. Kat, is there a last question that you want to finish up with?
Sure. I think I think there was a question that came through around what are the impacts of AI on new graduate jobs, and I think that's a really, really interesting one because it has an employer and an employee lens in the way that I thought about it. Is AI affecting graduate jobs? I think yes. Everything I've read and seen is that, you know, businesses are thinking that a lot of things can be automated, and they're looking at it from a business lens on how to potentially optimize using AI. And I've definitely seen that in the consulting field. I think there's probably two things I would say there. One, for graduates, if you're a graduate and you're thinking, oh my gosh, is AI going to replace my job? I think fear not. I personally still really love working with humans. And so, yeah, I think a lot of those really core skills that makes you a great employee is still going to be very relevant. And in my mind, those skills are at a graduate level, being a really curious learner. So in your early years, if you optimize for learning and exposing yourself to different experiences, I think that's very important. And at Nomos, we really value a growth mindset and learning. And yes, AI tools are useful and they can help humans scale. I don't think they really quite replace humans. Particularly, we've seen that in a lot of our programming and software engineering work. Yes, the tools are really helpful and sometimes it produces really good code. But ultimately, I think some of the best engineering I've seen in our company has been done by humans. And a lot of that comes down to an intimate understanding of the architecture and systems, but also an understanding of our customer and the kind of business value they're trying to generate. And that is something that AI, you know, isn't great at, understanding the human nuance and what users are looking for in terms of user experience, what businesses are looking for in terms of business value. And I think as a graduate, if you come in with that kind of mindset, that's really important and it's really valuable for any business. I think on a business side, I think there's like a long-term lens to the use of AI. If you think of it as a scaling tool rather than a replacement tool, I think that's actually more strategic. In that, for example, if you're thinking of, you know, reducing headcount as a quick win to save some money in the short term, what you're kind of exposed to a risk in the long term, which is that, you know, if you aren't growing that pipeline of junior team members that then grow into leaders, then who is your next layer of leaders? Will an AI be doing some of the leadership decisions? And so, yeah, you've got to really think of that pipeline of growth. So I think as a business, we think of AI as really a scaling and growth tool. And like many tools in our toolkit, it's one of those tools, but we don't really think of it as a replacer tool to kind of replace headcount. Lauren, do you have a perspective on that one?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think we're sort of running out of time here, but certainly I think, yeah, the times are changing. There's some roles where perhaps AI is taking that over more than others, but in many roles, it's just that things are changing. So, you know, lawyers will always be needed. The skill sets people value are, you know, getting that sort of assurance from a lawyer, they'll still be needed. It's just that the day-to-day tasks you're doing might change a bit.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lauren and Kat, for running through those Q&As that have been submitted by the attendees. that does conclude the main part of our webinar today. So if you'd like to contact Cat and the Nomos team, the contact details are on the screen below. And as mentioned, we will be sending these out with the recording of today's questions and answers in the next few days following the conclusion of the webinar. We thought you might be interested in our latest AI product liability fact sheet, which you can download via scanning the QR code on the screen here. And what is important to note is that in 2 weeks from today, our next webinar, which will be taking place in the employment space, Ask an Employment Lawyer, Contracts, Performance and Navigating Dismissals. That'll be the same time, 11 a.m. in 2 weeks' time on the 25th of September. If you'd like to join and register in the interim, you can go to the link below on the screen. And don't forget, if you would like to claim that complimentary consultation to discuss how LegalVision can assist your business, and specifically through our membership offering, then feel free to put in your details in the feedback survey at the end of the webinar, and we'll be in touch to book that in. Awesome. And thank you so much, everyone, for jumping on. That does conclude the end of the webinar for today. I'm sorry if we haven't answered your questions. As I mentioned, submit them in the survey and we'll get back to you on that. While this is a free webinar, as I mentioned, we do really value your feedback so that we can make these as valuable as possible to you. So any feedback is very helpful for us. And that's all from it for now. So thanks for joining us and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.